We talk endlessly about the kind of conflict between Putin and various European capitals and the burgeoning friendship between Trump and Putin and the war in Ukraine. When we discuss, geopolitics and arming up and all this, we forget that there was a fairly long window of opportunity after the end of the Cold War where not just Western businesses crowded into Ukraine trying to make money, but also Western culture, went to Ukraine and, the opening of the first McDonald's in Moscow and this sense that actually after, all these years of the Cold War and the divisions between East and West, there was a real opportunity here to see the two unite and combine. And at one stage, Vladimir Putin even talked about possibly joining NATO. Well, that seems like a very distant dream now. As part of that extraordinary opening up before the closing down was an attempt, and it's successful for 10 years, to bring the Muppets to Moscow. And behind this extraordinary attempt was one Natasha Lance Rogoff, award-winning American television producer and journalist, and she brought Sesame Street, or Ulitsa Sezam, is that the right pronunciation?
Very good.
Ulitsa Sezam to Moscow in the 1990s. And she's chronicled this in her book, Muppets in Moscow, the unexpected, crazy, true story of making Sesame Street in Russia. Welcome, Natasha.
Thanks so much for having me on your show, Matt. I mean, it's remarkable how this story, from 30 years ago is so relevant to today. And, as we're watching Trump attempt to navigate with Putin today, I keep thinking about how I experienced and my team of 400 artists, Russians, Ukrainians, Armenians, Georgians, had to experience the same volatility, including, just yesterday, the Russian general's car was bombed.
Yeah.
And that is actually how our story began, because when I first came to Moscow, I had already been living in Russia for about 5 years before that. But, our first broadcast investor was, his car was blown up. And then our broadcast partner was assassanated. This is all in the early...
This is because of Muppets.
This is all in the early 1990s.
The mortality of Muppets, my goodness.
Yeah, so you think about, what was going on at that time period in the 1990s. Yes, it was very violent. This was a period of time which, the Russian people and Ukrainians and other people were facing a huge historical change.
Yeah.
And for Russia, it was a time of the superpower implosion, which was incredibly humiliating. And what's fascinating is I think about, I'd love for President Trump to read Muppets in Moscow because he would learn a lot about the underlying history and culture of Russia through the making of this children's puppet show.
Yeah.
So, there were many...
Although he might think it's about him. And an insult.
And he may want a new puppet to be created in exchange for providing funding for Sesame Street, too. I don't know.
Anything is possible these days, Natasha.
Yes.
So, excuse me. I guess Russians at the time might have said, we don't need Muppets from America to come to Moscow. We have our own puppets. We're famous for our puppets.
Yeah, no, that's exactly right. It's very interesting that you know about that because Sergei Obraztsov, was really the master puppeteer who invented puppetry, basically.
Yeah.
Jim Henson, the creator of the Muppets, said so himself. And so when we first started working with the team in Moscow, I showed them videos of Cookie Monster and Elmo and everything. And they hated the puppets. They were like, Natasha, we have a very revered, rich tradition of puppetry dating back to the 16th century, and we don't need your American Muppets.
Right.
So there were a lot of challenges.
But you won them over in the end.
Won them over.
And how do you do that?
Well, they ended up creating what I think is the most artistically genius Muppet ever built. And this character was absolutely based on Russian folklore. Domovoy, who is in children's literature, the spirit of the hearth in the home and a spirit of nature. So they created this 8-foot, giant-size blue Muppet called Zeliboba, who had fur and also the coat. Inside the coat, the whole coat had leaves and twigs and grass sewn into it so that the Muppet is at one with
Camouflage.
nature.
Sorry. Yeah.
Your brain is going to the war
I'm in
constantly.
The
I got to pull you back to the happy
place. Bring me back to the happy place, exactly.
Yes. And I'd say that, the book is very hopeful because the show went on to become a huge hit. It aired for over a decade, well into Putin's era. And, when the war broke out, many of the people we saw, close to, 1 million or more people leaving the country. And many of these people were in their 20s, 30s, and 40s. And when I met a lot of these Ukrainians, Russians, Georgians, often in Britain, when I was coming back and forth doing book talks, they spoke about how much Ulitsa Sezam meant to them.
Yeah.
That it was, their childhood show. The show
It's the power of soft power and storytelling.
Absolutely.
And that's been lost, hasn't it? I mean, at the moment, if you grow up, in this country or in America, all you hear about Russia is Vladimir Putin and war in Ukraine. And the cultural link to Russia, which is a great cultural link, the great authors of Russian literature, the great music of Russia, all that, it's still out there, but it's, at one stage it was even censored, or it's been ignored, or people just don't know about it.
No, I mean, that's part of why I wanted to write the book. I wrote it during COVID, and then this was a time when everybody was watching Netflix, and every single show on television had Russian characters that were either an oligarch, a thug, a prostitute. I just thought, oh my God, this doesn't represent the people that I worked with, the hundreds of artists who, from Russia, from Ukraine, from these different, new independent countries, who really embrace the ideals of Sesame Street, compassion, tolerance. It was different from America. It wasn't the same show. The show absolutely reflected Russian and what I would say Slavic, broader Slavic culture. But it was a moment when we were all coming together, working together. So seeing what's happened over, the last couple of years compared to what we were able to do before is horrifying.
So as someone who knows Russia and speaks the language and you've lived there for years, even though it's a different Russia now in some ways to what it was when you were there, what are we missing about Russia that we should not be missing right now? And what do the Russians make of the way they're being portrayed by the rest of the world and what they are doing, in the country of Ukraine?
Well, that's a really interesting question because if you look at the period of the 1990s when I was there working, this is the period that features in almost every one of Putin's speeches. He is constantly referencing this time as a time when he he was just becoming the leader of the country, and he developed his own approach to foreign policy during that time as well. And this was a time when he felt that Russia was taken advantage of during its weakness. And there is some truth to that. I write about that in the book quite a bit. You had all these people coming in and, essentially making a lot of money. And there was a real pressure to, build a free market. In our case, when we addressed this subject in our show and worked with educators who were defining what they wanted to teach children of the future Russia. And so we had to be sensitive to that. And I think a piece of what we're missing today is taking into account that history. And Trump today is getting a lesson in this.
Just finally and very briefly, the end of USAID as one of the examples of soft American power. Yours was even softer, soft American power. When you lose that ability to display soft power, you're losing something else, aren't you?
You're losing so much. I mean, our program, Ulitsa Sezam, was actually supported by the U.S. Congress and by USAID, the same institution that has been, that Trump has slated for elimination, though it is still in process and who knows what will happen.
Who knows?
But I do think it is hubris to think that the United States doesn't need a voice overseas that is a sensitive voice responding to other cultures and also trying to bridge the gap using the arts.